Imagine this: you wake up tomorrow morning feeling drained, unmotivated, scattered, yet you cannot pinpoint why. Your schedule is manageable. Your responsibilities are clear. But something invisible has been draining you from within, something so subtle that you've convinced yourself it's normal. You reach for your phone, scroll through endless stimulation, feel a brief spark of satisfaction, and then, nothing. The emptiness returns, heavier than before. You tell yourself it's just how life is now, that everyone feels this way, that maybe you're just tired. But what if the exhaustion isn't from what you're doing, but from what you're losing without even realizing it? What if the very thing you turn to for relief is the exact force stealing your vitality, your clarity, your power? What if the modern world has trained you to leak your most potent energy into fleeting moments of pleasure, leaving you weaker, more distracted, and further from the person you could become? And what if centuries ago, a philosopher warned us about this exact trap, a trap so seductive that most people spend their entire lives inside it, never once questioning whether the bars are real? Today you will see how this energy transforms into personal power. How it influences your mind and behavior, and why ignoring Nietzsche's warning can make you a prisoner of your own instincts. And stay with me until the end, because the final revelation is the most important and the most transformative of all. Imagine unlocking a source of vitality that philosophers, mystics, and psychologists have spoken about for centuries. From the teachings of Arthur Schopenhauer to the insights of Carl Jung, from ancient Taoist traditions to modern neuroscience, the connection between desire and personal power is undeniable. But Nietzsche looked deeper. He understood something that most people still ignore, that pleasure, when uncontrolled, turns the individual into a spectator of their own life, drifting without direction, enslaved by impulses that feel like freedom, but actually consume their inner strength. This video will not merely explain theories. It will guide you into a new understanding of your own energy, your habits, and the subtle mechanisms that shape your will. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to the channel, leave a like, comment your thoughts, and share this video with someone who needs this message. Throughout this journey, you will hear ideas that can change the way you understand yourself, your mind, and your relationship with pleasure. Here's the paradox: pleasure feels like freedom, but what if it's the most sophisticated form of imprisonment? You chase it because it promises release, satisfaction, escape. Yet the more you pursue it, the more enslaved you become to the next hit, the next distraction, the next moment of stimulation. You believe you're choosing pleasure, but are you? Or has pleasure chosen you, shaped you, trained you to respond on command like a reflex you no longer control? Friedrich Nietzsche saw this centuries before smartphones, before infinite digital temptation, before the dopamine economy was engineered to hijack your attention. He warned that sexual energy, one of the most powerful forces within the human psyche, becomes dangerous not because it exists, but because when left undirected, it corrodes the will, dissolves ambition, and transforms a person into a passive spectator of their own existence. He didn't moralize about sin or guilt. He spoke of something far more existential: the slow, invisible death of your potential. Think about how much of your life unfolds on autopilot. How many of your decisions are genuinely yours, and how many are simply responses to impulses you never questioned? When desire arises, do you examine it, redirect it, or do you simply obey? And if you obey every time, who is really in control, you or the impulse? This is not a question of morality. This is a question of power. Who commands your inner world? Who decides where your energy goes? Nietzsche believed that the quality of a person's life could be measured by their ability to master their drives rather than be mastered by them. He saw that most people drift through life, blown by winds they never learned to harness, mistaking reaction for choice, stimulation for satisfaction, distraction for living. And the tragedy, he argued, is that this energy, this raw, primal force, could have been transformed into something extraordinary. It could have become creativity, ambition, resilience, clarity. It could have forged an identity strong enough to withstand life's harshest storms. Instead, it evaporates into momentary sensations that leave nothing behind but a hollow ache and the vague sense that something essential has been lost. But here's what most people never realize: this isn't about deprivation. It's about transmutation. The same energy that pulls you toward distraction can be redirected into the construction of a more powerful self. The question is not whether you have desires. You do, everyone does. The question is what you do with them. Do you spend them carelessly, or do you channel them deliberately? Do you let them scatter you, or do you forge them into focus? Consider this: every great work of art, every profound insight, every moment of deep accomplishment required someone to hold their energy long enough to let it mature into something meaningful. They didn't suppress desire, they transformed it. They felt the pull toward ease and chose difficulty. They recognized the seduction of comfort and walked toward challenge instead. And in doing so, they discovered a kind of power that those who constantly indulge can never access. So ask yourself now, before we go any deeper, what would your life look like if your energy served your highest vision instead of your lowest impulse? What could you build if you stopped leaking vitality into distractions that promise everything and deliver nothing? What kind of person could you become if you learned to hold the fire within you instead of letting it burn out in meaningless flickers? This is where Nietzsche's warning becomes urgent. This is where the choice between strength and dissolution reveals itself. And this is where the journey begins, into the hidden mechanisms of desire, the psychology of self-mastery, and the radical transformation that awaits those willing to confront the most powerful force within themselves. The problem begins long before you notice it. It starts in the quiet moments when you reach for distraction without thinking, when you surrender to impulse before your conscious mind even registers the choice. You've been conditioned, not through force, but through something far more insidious, the promise that pleasure is harmless, natural, and therefore beyond questioning. Society whispers that desire is simply part of being human, that indulging it is self-care, that resisting it is repression. But what if this entire framework is a trap designed to keep you weak? Nietzsche understood something that most people spend their lives refusing to see, that the individual who cannot resist pleasure becomes a slave to it, and slavery disguised as freedom is the most dangerous form of bondage. He wasn't interested in moralistic judgments about right and wrong. He was interested in power, psychological power, the kind that determines whether you shape your life or your life shapes you. And he recognized that sexual energy, when left unexamined and undirected, doesn't simply exist neutrally in the background. It actively reshapes your character, erodes your willpower, and transforms you into someone who reacts rather than creates. Carl Jung went even deeper into this psychological territory. He wrote that whatever remains unconscious within us eventually controls us from the shadows. Sexual desire, when repressed or mindlessly indulged, becomes one of the most potent forces in the unconscious mind. It doesn't disappear when ignored, and it doesn't remain neutral when constantly satisfied. Instead, it grows, mutates, and begins to pull strings you don't even know exist. You think you're making free choices, but you're actually following scripts written by impulses you never learned to confront. The energy pushes, demands, insists, and most people never realize they're being commanded by something inside themselves. Arthur Schopenhauer called this force the will to life, a blind, relentless drive that cares nothing for your happiness, your growth, or your potential. It only wants to perpetuate itself, to continue the cycle, to keep you in service to its demands. Schopenhauer saw that most people live as puppets of this will, convinced they're pursuing their own desires when really they're being used by a biological imperative that has no interest in their individuality. The tragedy, he argued, is that humans possess the unique capacity to rise above this blind will, to redirect it consciously, but most never even attempt it because they've been taught that fighting desire is unnatural. But here's the hidden truth that modern culture desperately wants you to ignore: what feels natural isn't always beneficial. Fire is natural. Disease is natural. Decay is natural. The impulse to seek immediate pleasure over long-term growth is natural, but it's also the pathway to a weakened self, a fragmented identity, and a life spent in service to forces you never learned to master. Nietzsche saw that the human being is defined not by their impulses but by their capacity to transform those impulses into something higher. The raw instinct is neutral. What matters is whether you become its master or its servant. This is where the problem reveals its true depth, every moment you give in to unconsidered desire, you're training your mind to choose the path of least resistance. You're teaching yourself that discomfort should be avoided, that patience is unnecessary, that discipline is optional. And these lessons accumulate. They compound. Over weeks, months, years, they shape the very structure of your character. Your willpower atrophies. Your tolerance for delayed gratification diminishes. Your ability to pursue meaningful, challenging goals weakens. You become someone who needs constant stimulation to feel alive, and when the stimulation fades, you're left with an emptiness you can no longer fill. Viktor Frankl, who survived the horrors of Nazi concentration camps, discovered something profound about human nature, that the people who endured the worst suffering were those who had a sense of meaning strong enough to override their immediate circumstances. They could hold their energy, their focus, their will towards something beyond momentary relief. But those who collapsed into despair were often those who had never developed that inner strength, who had spent their lives seeking comfort and avoiding discomfort. When true hardship arrived, they had no psychological foundation to stand on. This is the warning Nietzsche tried to give, that a life spent in pursuit of pleasure creates a self too weak to endure reality. You become fragile, reactive, dependent on external conditions for your internal state. And the modern world has amplified this problem exponentially. We're surrounded by engineered temptation, algorithms designed to trigger your impulses, images crafted to bypass your rational mind, entire industries built on the premise that you cannot control yourself. They're betting on your weakness. They're counting on you never learning to master the energy within you. So the question becomes inescapable: how much of your identity has been shaped by impulses you never questioned? How many of your habits exist because you chose them consciously, and how many exist because you simply surrendered to what felt easy in the moment? And if your character has been built on a foundation of compulsive reactions rather than deliberate choices, who are you really? This is the hidden problem, not that desire exists, but that most people have allowed desire to construct their entire sense of self without ever realizing it was happening. The consequences of this surrender don't announce themselves dramatically. There's no moment when you wake up and realize you've lost yourself. Instead, the erosion happens quietly, imperceptibly, like water wearing down stone. You don't notice the exact moment your ambition weakens, your focus scatters, or your sense of purpose begins to blur. You only notice, years later, that the person you imagined becoming feels impossibly distant, and you can't quite explain why the gap between your potential and your reality grew so wide. This is the insidious nature of pleasure as a refuge. It feels like relief in the moment, but it's actually a slow-acting poison that numbs your capacity for growth. Every time you choose immediate gratification over delayed fulfillment, you're not just making a single decision, you're rewiring your brain's reward system. Neuroscience has shown that the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for decision-making, self-control, and long-term planning, strengthens when you resist impulses and weakens when you constantly indulge them. This isn't metaphorical. It's biological. Your brain physically changes based on whether you practice discipline or surrender to distraction. What this means is that the more you give in to unconsidered desire, the harder it becomes to resist the next time. You're not building willpower, you're dismantling it. You're training your mind to expect instant rewards, and when reality demands patience, effort, and sustained focus, your brain rebels. Tasks that require deep concentration feel unbearable. Goals that demand months or years of consistent effort feel impossible. Discomfort, which is the very crucible where character is forged, becomes something you cannot tolerate. And slowly, without recognizing it, you become a person who lives at the mercy of whatever impulse speaks loudest in the moment. Nietzsche called this state, the last man, a person who has lost the hunger for anything beyond comfort and safety. The last man seeks only ease, avoids all struggle, and mistakes the absence of pain for happiness. But Nietzsche saw that this existence is a kind of living death, a life drained of intensity, meaning, and the capacity for self-overcoming. The last man doesn't suffer dramatically, he simply drifts, consuming pleasures that leave no trace, pursuing goals he abandons at the first sign of difficulty, becoming smaller and more passive with each passing year. Look around at the modern world and ask yourself, How many people do you know who are genuinely building themselves into something greater? How many are actively challenging their limitations, confronting their weaknesses, pushing toward a vision of themselves that demands sacrifice and transformation? And how many are simply managing their existence, moving from one distraction to the next, seeking relief rather than growth, comfort rather than meaning? The invisible consequence of uncontrolled sexual energy is that it drains the very fuel you need for self-creation. Carl Jung described libido not merely as sexual desire but as the fundamental psychic energy that powers all human activity, creativity, ambition, intellectual pursuit, emotional depth. When this energy is constantly leaked through compulsive habits, you're left running on empty. Your motivation becomes inconsistent. Your emotional state becomes fragile. Your ability to sustain effort toward meaningful goals collapses. You feel perpetually tired, not because you're working too hard, but because you're spending your energy on activities that generate no lasting value. And here's what makes this trap so effective: pleasure creates the illusion of satisfaction while actually deepening your emptiness. You feel good for a moment, and then the hollowness returns, often stronger than before. So you seek pleasure again, hoping this time it will fill the void. But it never does, because the void isn't created by a lack of pleasure, it's created by a lack of purpose, meaning, and the deep fulfillment that only comes from building something that challenges you. Pleasure is a symptom reliever. It temporarily masks the ache of an undeveloped self. But the ache always returns because the underlying problem, a life not fully lived, a potential not fully realized, remains untouched. This is why Nietzsche warned that hedonism, the pursuit of pleasure as life's primary goal, leads inevitably to nihilism, the belief that nothing has meaning. When pleasure becomes your highest value, everything else loses significance. Relationships become transactions for gratification. Work becomes something to endure until you can escape back into comfort. Even your own growth becomes secondary to maintaining the flow of pleasant sensations. And eventually, you look at your life and realize it feels empty, not because nothing is happening, but because nothing meaningful is being created. The modern digital age has weaponized this dynamic. You carry a device that can deliver instant stimulation at any moment, designed by teams of engineers whose explicit goal is to capture and hold your attention. Every notification, every infinite scroll, every algorithmically curated feed is built to trigger your dopamine system and keep you coming back. Your impulses are being farmed for profit. Your attention is being harvested. And your energy, the raw vitality you could be channeling into the construction of a powerful, purposeful life, is being siphoned off into interactions that benefit everyone except you. Nietzsche couldn't have imagined the scale of today's temptation, but his warning is more urgent than ever: whoever cannot control their pleasure cannot control their life. The individual becomes predictable, manipulable, easy to distract and easy to weaken. This isn't a conspiracy, it's a psychological reality. When your impulses dictate your behavior, you're no longer operating as an autonomous agent. You're reacting to stimuli, following patterns, living on autopilot. And the life that emerges from this reactive state is not the life you consciously chose, it's the life that happens to you while you're busy seeking the next hit of satisfaction. So ask yourself, how much of your potential has already been lost to distractions you can barely remember? How many hours, days, years have evaporated into pleasures that left nothing behind but regret and exhaustion? And what could you have built with that same energy if you had learned to hold it, direct it, transform it into something that actually mattered? This is the urgency Nietzsche wanted you to feel, not guilt, but awakening. The recognition that every moment you spend unconsciously surrendering to impulse is a moment you could have spent constructing a stronger self. The rebellion begins the moment you stop believing the lie that you are your impulses. For your entire life, you've been taught that desire is destiny, that when the urge arises, satisfaction must follow. But what if the opposite is true? What if the moment of desire is actually an invitation, not to surrender, but to choose? What if every impulse that arises is simply raw energy waiting for direction, and you are the one who decides where it goes? This is the radical shift Nietzsche demanded: stop seeing yourself as a passive recipient of drives and start seeing yourself as the sculptor of those drives. You are not a creature who must obey every instinct. You are a creator who can transform instinct into will, and will into power. The energy doesn't disappear when you resist it, it changes form. It becomes clarity. It becomes focus. It becomes the fuel for the construction of something far more valuable than a fleeting sensation, a self you can trust. The ancient Taoist masters understood this transformation intimately. They spoke of sexual energy as Jing, the life essence that could either be spent wastefully or refined into Shen, spiritual clarity and mental power. They developed practices specifically designed to circulate this energy upward through the body rather than expelling it downward. The goal wasn't repression, it was elevation. They recognized that the same force which creates physical life can also create psychological and spiritual life, but only if consciously directed. When you learn to hold this energy, you don't feel deprived. You feel intensified, more present, more alive in ways that temporary pleasure never provides. Carl Jung called this process sublimation, the transformation of base instincts into higher forms of expression. He observed that the most creative, productive, and psychologically integrated individuals were often those who had learned to channel their libidinal energy into their work, their relationships, their art, their intellectual pursuits. They didn't suppress their desires out of fear or shame, they recognized that the energy behind desire was too powerful to waste on momentary release. They held it, let it build, and directed it toward the creation of something meaningful. The result wasn't frustration. It was power. Sigmund Freud, despite his controversial theories, acknowledged this same principle. He saw that civilization itself was built on the capacity of humans to delay gratification and redirect instinctual energy toward productive ends. The person who cannot wait, who cannot endure discomfort, who demands immediate satisfaction, remains psychologically infantile. But the person who develops the capacity to hold their energy, to tolerate tension, to choose long-term fulfillment over short-term relief, that person becomes capable of genuine achievement, deep relationships, and lasting self-respect. Modern neuroscience confirms what these philosophers and mystics intuited: resisting impulses strengthens the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for executive function, planning, and self-regulation. Every time you choose discipline over distraction, you're literally building mental architecture that makes future discipline easier. You're training your brain to prioritize long-term rewards over immediate ones. You're teaching yourself that discomfort is temporary but growth is cumulative. And over time, this training transforms not just your behavior but your identity. But here's the crucial insight that most people miss: this transformation doesn't require you to become someone you're not. It requires you to become more fully yourself. When you're constantly leaking energy through compulsive habits, you're operating as a fraction of your potential. You're living in a perpetual state of depletion, always seeking the next refill but never building a reserve. When you learn to conserve and redirect this energy, you're not adding something foreign to yourself, you're reclaiming something that was always yours. You're gathering the scattered pieces of your attention, your willpower, your vitality, and integrating them into a coherent force. Consider the lives of those who embodied this principle. Leonardo da Vinci, whose notebooks reveal a mind of staggering breadth and depth, was known for his ability to immerse himself completely in his work, often to the exclusion of physical pleasures. Nikola Tesla spoke explicitly about conserving his sexual energy to maintain his mental clarity and creative power. Many great athletes, warriors, and artists throughout history have practiced periods of abstinence before important endeavors, recognizing that sexual energy and competitive, creative energy come from the same source. They understood intuitively what philosophy and science would later confirm, that the force which drives procreation is the same force that drives all forms of creation. So how do you begin this transformation? It starts with awareness. Before you can redirect energy, you must first recognize when it's being triggered and where it's being spent. Notice the patterns. When do urges arise? What situations, emotions, or thoughts precede them? Are you seeking pleasure because you genuinely desire it, or because you're avoiding something else: boredom, anxiety, loneliness, the discomfort of focused work? Most compulsive behavior is actually avoidance behavior. You're not moving towards something you want, you're fleeing from something you don't want to feel. Once you understand the pattern, you can interrupt it. When desire arises, pause. Don't judge it. Don't shame yourself. Simply observe it as a phenomenon, a wave of energy moving through your nervous system. Notice that it has a beginning, a peak, and, if you don't act on it, an end. Urges are temporary. They feel overwhelming in the moment, but if you can sit with the discomfort for even 10 minutes, you'll often find that the intensity diminishes on its own. This simple act of observation, of creating space between impulse and action, is the foundation of self-mastery. Then comes the redirection. When you feel that energy rising, consciously channel it into something productive. Go for a run. Lift weights. Work on a creative project. Engage in deep, focused study. Have a meaningful conversation. The energy doesn't disappear, it shifts. And when it shifts into activities that build you rather than deplete you, you begin to experience a different kind of satisfaction. Not the quick hit of pleasure, but the deeper fulfillment of knowing you're becoming someone stronger, someone more capable, someone you can genuinely respect. This is the rebellion Nietzsche called for, the refusal to be ruled by forces you never questioned. It's the decision to stop being a passive consumer of sensations and start being an active creator of your own character. And the beautiful irony is that this rebellion doesn't lead to a life of deprivation, it leads to a life of genuine freedom, the freedom that comes from knowing you are no longer at the mercy of impulses you cannot control. Here is the truth that Nietzsche believed most people die without understanding: the struggle against your own impulses is not a burden to escape, it is the very crucible through which greatness is forged. The tension you feel between desire and discipline, between immediate pleasure and long-term purpose, is not a flaw in your design. It is the fundamental dynamic that separates those who create themselves from those who are created by circumstances. Every moment you stand at this crossroads, you are choosing not just an action but an identity. You are deciding who you will become. Nietzsche's deepest warning was never simply about abstaining from pleasure. It was about what pleasure makes you forget when it becomes your primary compass, your own potential for transformation. When you live in constant pursuit of comfort and stimulation, you lose touch with the part of yourself that hungers for something more, something that cannot be purchased, consumed, or experienced passively. You lose contact with the voice inside you that whispers, "You could be more than this. You could build something that outlasts the moment. You could become someone worth becoming." This forgetting is the real tragedy. Not moral failure. Not sin. Not even weakness, exactly. But amnesia, a gradual loss of memory about what you could be if you gathered all your scattered energy and directed it toward a single, burning purpose. Pleasure lulls you into believing that life is about feeling good, when the deeper truth is that life is about becoming real. And you only become real through struggle, through resistance, through the repeated choice to transform what is base within you into something elevated. Think about the nature of identity itself. Who you are is not fixed. You are not a static entity with predetermined characteristics. You are a process, a becoming, a work perpetually in progress. And the raw material of this work is your energy, sexual energy, creative energy, willpower, attention, vitality. These are not separate forces. They are different expressions of the same fundamental life energy that the ancient traditions called by many names: prana, chi, elan vital, libido. This energy is what animates you, what makes you capable of action, thought, creation, and growth. When this energy is constantly discharged through compulsive pleasure-seeking, you remain in a state of perpetual depletion. You never accumulate enough force to undertake anything truly demanding. Your goals remain small because your energy reserve is small. Your ambitions stay vague because you lack the sustained focus to make them concrete. Your sense of self remains fragmented because you're constantly pulled in different directions by impulses you haven't integrated. You become, in Nietzsche's terms, a creature of ressentiment, someone who resents their own weakness but lacks the strength to overcome it, who blames external circumstances for internal failures, who lives in a state of chronic dissatisfaction without ever addressing its root cause. But observe what happens when you begin to conserve this energy, when you resist the immediate pull of gratification and hold the tension within yourself. Something extraordinary begins to occur. The energy doesn't dissipate, it intensifies. It accumulates. It begins to press against the boundaries of your current self, demanding expression in new forms. You find yourself capable of focus you couldn't achieve before. Tasks that once felt impossible now feel challenging but approachable. Your emotions stabilize because you're no longer riding the volatile waves of constant stimulation and depletion. Your confidence grows, not from affirmations or external validation, but from the simple, undeniable fact that you are keeping promises to yourself. This is what Nietzsche meant by the creation of the higher self, not a perfect version of you, but a stronger version. A version that has integrated its shadows, mastered its impulses, and transformed raw instinct into conscious will. This higher self doesn't emerge from comfort. It emerges from the repeated choice to endure discomfort for the sake of something more meaningful than momentary relief. It emerges from the willingness to feel desire without immediately acting on it, to hold the fire inside you until you can direct it deliberately rather than letting it burn wildly. Carl Jung understood this process intimately. He wrote that the conscious confrontation with the shadow, the parts of ourselves we prefer not to acknowledge, is essential for psychological integration. Sexual impulses, when denied or indulged unconsciously, become part of this shadow. They control us from beneath awareness, shaping our behavior in ways we don't recognize. But when we bring them into consciousness, examine them without judgment, and learn to work with them deliberately, they cease to be autonomous complexes that hijack our behavior. They become resources, sources of energy we can harness for our conscious purposes. This integration is not a one-time event. It is a practice, a discipline that must be renewed continuously. Every day presents new moments of choice. Every moment of desire is an opportunity to either strengthen your will or dissolve it. And here is where Nietzsche's philosophy becomes intensely practical. He believed that life itself is will to power, not power over others, but power over oneself. The capacity to shape your own becoming, to decide consciously what you will value, pursue, and embody. Sexual energy, properly understood, is one of the purest expressions of this will to power because it represents the force of life itself seeking expression. When you waste this force on fleeting pleasures, you are quite literally wasting your life force. You are spending the currency of your vitality on transactions that return no value. But when you learn to hold this energy, to let it build, to redirect it through your chosen pursuits, you are compounding your life force. You are investing it in activities that generate returns, skills, relationships, creations, insights, character development. Over time, this compounding transforms not just what you can do but who you are. Now consider the scope of this transformation over a lifetime. Imagine two paths diverging from this moment. On one path, you continue as you have been, following impulses without examination, seeking comfort without question, allowing your energy to drain away in pursuits that leave no trace. 10 years from now, where does this path lead? You will likely find yourself with less vitality, less clarity, less sense of purpose than you have right now. The person you could have become will remain forever potential, never actualized. And on your deathbed, if you're honest with yourself, you will know that you never truly tested the limits of what you could be. On the other path, you begin today to practice conscious redirection of your energy. You notice when impulses arise and you create space between urge and action. You channel your sexual energy into creative work, physical training, intellectual development, meaningful relationships. You learn to endure discomfort not as punishment but as the price of growth. 10 years from now, where does this path lead? You will have built something, perhaps a body of work, perhaps a depth of skill, perhaps a quality of character, that compounds with each passing year. You will know yourself as someone who keeps promises, who follows through, who transforms intention into reality. And the person you've become will be someone you genuinely respect, not because you're perfect, but because you were willing to struggle with yourself and win. This is Nietzsche's ultimate message, that the meaning of your life is not given to you by pleasure, by society, by biology, or by fate. The meaning of your life is what you forge through the conscious transformation of your own energy. You are the artist and the artwork. You are the sculptor and the marble. And sexual energy, properly understood and directed, is one of your most powerful tools for this self-creation. The final revelation is this: strength is not the absence of desire. Strength is the ability to hold desire in your hands and shape it into something that elevates you. When you master this, when you learn to feel the full force of your impulses without being controlled by them, you discover a kind of freedom that pleasure alone could never provide. You become someone who acts from choice rather than compulsion, from vision rather than reaction, from power rather than weakness. Look at your life right now with complete honesty. What have you been building? Who have you been becoming? And if the answer doesn't satisfy you, understand that this moment, right now, is the only moment where transformation can begin. Not tomorrow. Not when conditions are perfect. Not when you feel ready. Now. Nietzsche believed that every human being carries within them the seed of greatness, but only those who are willing to endure the struggle with their own nature will ever see that seed grow into something real. The choice is always yours. Will you spend your life force on pleasures that dissolve as quickly as they arrive? Or will you gather that force, hold it, transform it, and build yourself into someone capable of genuine power, genuine creation, genuine freedom? The path is demanding. It requires you to stand alone against impulses that most people never question. It requires you to choose discomfort when comfort is readily available. It requires you to trust that the person you're becoming is worth the sacrifice of momentary pleasures. But the reward is nothing less than your own life, fully lived, consciously created, authentically yours. This is the transformation Nietzsche spoke of. This is the warning he tried to give. And this is the power that awaits anyone brave enough to take their energy back from the forces that would waste it, and direct it toward the creation of a self worthy of the life they've been given. The question is no longer what you should do. The question is, who will you choose to become?